Well, thank you all for joining us today. Just wanted to say, appreciate you being part of the program. We're going to have an interesting presentation today from Minnesota, so looking forward to that. And also, happy GIS Day. Appreciate all the work that all of you do every day. Every day is GIS Day in our world, so thank you. As you all are aware, the 3DHP for the nation is a NSGIC USGS cooperative agreement, and it's intended to engage state and local governments in the derivation of a 3D stream network. And we have lots of good fun and lots of good information from folks. I just quickly wanted to go over, we're going to kind of cover two things today, and we're going to cover something in addition to the presentation today. So I just want to move quickly. You all are all aware that we have the monthly forum. And when I get a chance, I want to dump a bunch of links. I'll put them all in at once to where you can access most of this information. If you're not a member of the 3DHP interest group, please do join us. We'd love to have you in there. With regards to, we do an inventory of 3DHP experiences. I will throw that link in the chat if you are working in elevation-derived hydrography or any facet of 3D hydrography. We'd love to have your information. We maintain that information at the hub, and people can access it and ask additional questions. We also have tasks to support 3DHP implementations. As you all are well aware, we developed a set of critical factors. We've developed guidance. We've got part 1, part 2 is in progress, and then we compile best practices. And in a moment, I'm going to talk to you about our next task within that best practices approach is culvert mapping. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail in the next, in a slide or two. And then finally, going back to our standing tasks, we have the hub, and we provide the USGS. We provide them 3DHP feedback. Let me grab these links, throw them in the chat. It'll be one fell. Finally realized that trying to do it by slide is not the most effective means. Hopefully everything you need to know is in there. If not, just speak up and we'll get you what you need. All right, with that said, I'd like to talk a little bit about this culvert mapping activity we're about to undertake. It's really an exploration of culvert mapping techniques and attributes and how you're using this information. Just as background, it did come out of our critical factors. They identified that culverts is a key feature that we'll need to integrate with the 3DHP data model. And we all know, not we all, but I'm learning, culvert data is a key component of the hydroforce DEMs, and that can fuel both the hydrologic and hydraulic modeling, as well as the derivation of the surface model. So it's an important feature as we move forward with our development of state hydrography data sets. The purpose of this particular activity is to inform and engage you all as to the benefits and options for mapping culverts, and we want to do it in a manner that supports both analysis and the development of the 3DHP data. Our objectives are, first of all, identify culvert mapping strategies that you're currently using, educate the interest group members about culvert mapping activities that can be performed in preparation, and inform the 3DHP about state needs with respect to culvert mapping. Some of the tasks we're going to take on here, to be more specific, are, first of all, we want to find out who's doing culvert mapping. Then we want to facilitate presentations and discussion to explore those efforts. And I want to make this point clear. We know we have states at different levels of resources and capabilities, and we want to make sure we're touching those that have advanced and well-organized and well-funded operations, as well as those that are, basically trying to make do. One of those presentations that we'd like to do is we do plan on holding a workshop at the NSGIC mid-year meeting. We'd love for you to be there, and one of the aspects of that workshop will be looking specifically at attributes in addition to the other efforts. If you're interested in participating in that as a state showcase, please reach out to me. Or if you're interested in participating at all, please reach out to me. We're trying to do that first level of identifying existing efforts. We're going to compile that information, whether it's techniques, attributes, data applications, benefits and challenges. We'll compile that information and probably try to work out some sort of a lessons learned document. and then identify the very practical measures states can take now to prepare culvert data that is going to effectively integrate with and support the development of 3D HP. So, and we're going to have USGS, when they talk about the data model, explain, they're going to talk about the role of culverts into 3D HP. And as most of you know, it'll be a national framework in which we can plug in our own data versus trying to maintain a national culvert data set. So I'll just quickly ask if anybody has any questions or comments, or nothing showed up in chat, Phil. So, oh, I didn't hit the send button. I thought I did. And now you can see it. Thank you, Phil.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, it's the way today is going. So any questions or comments, or anybody about what we're trying to, this is just a R&D initiative right now, just who's doing what with culverts. And I appreciate, we have had some outreach from Pennsylvania and I think one other state about participation, and we have followed up with them as well. See no questions, hearing no questions. We would love to kick off this task with a presentation from Minnesota, and looks different on my screen than it does on the big screen. We'll have a presentation from a group from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources about lessons learned through their efforts to approach EDH using culvert mapping and breach lines. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rick Moore, and I will stop sharing. Rick, and you can take over.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to have Sean Vaughn start the presentation off here, and then Clint and I will give different parts of the presentation later on. So Sean, if you want to start sharing your screen and introduce yourself.
Yeah, I did share. Let me know if you're seeing it, Linda or Rick, and I'll go into slide one.
Yep.
And I will just add, if you have questions, please enter them into the chat at any time, and we'll capture those and make sure we follow up with them.
Yeah, we really do encourage questions to be asked. We hope to see a lot of dialogue come out of this at the end for sure.
So Sean, we are seeing your presentation mode. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm just getting my ducks in a row here. Got a little flustered because I went to share, but I didn't know I had to hit another button that says share.
Yeah, that's the Zoom thing. You got to hit that share button.
Yeah, we all struggle with all these different platforms. It's always a challenge. So, okay. Well, thanks for that great introduction, Linda. And like Rick said, I'm going to take over, and maybe we'll ask, each of us have 3 sections in this presentation. Maybe each of us will do a quick intro. You can see on screen there who we are. I'm Sean Vaughn, and I'm I'm a lot of things. I've been a GIS hydrologist for most of my career, but really specialized in watershed mapping, the use of LiDAR, modifying LiDAR-derived DEMs and culvert inventories. And all this really fits into really where I'm happy to see things going at a national level is elevation-derived hydrography. I've been involved in these conversations for a very long time, going back at least 20 years. Jeff Simley led a lot of these conversations at the federal level, representing USGS. Ricardo Lopez out of New York. These are some folks who have since retired, but there was a group of us that really carried this conversation quite often with the goal of seeing a program in place to derive hydrography from LiDAR. And so I'm really excited about this opportunity for us to give this presentation today. And so I'll stop there about myself, and I'll let Rick and Clint talk a little bit about themselves, and I'll chime in with some additional introduction to them, how we fit into the committee that we're representing. So the goals, there's so many of our goals here that really were encapsulated by Linda's introduction here. Certainly to provide guidance, and like I said, we really want to generate some conversation here for sure. We're going to share with you some of the work that's been done in Minnesota, and really lessons learned focused around culvert mapping, and then lessons learned in creating elevation-derived hydrography, at least as a pilot, let's say, in the state of Minnesota. And Clint will be talking about that more. And then certainly the conditions, I should say, considerations that goes into this. And you're going to see some terminology here that might be new to some of you, and I'm going to cover that in an upcoming slide. But right there, standing out front and center here in this last bullet, DM hydro-modification. I'll be introducing that terminology to you, so it helps you understand how we use that here in Minnesota, as well as through this presentation today. So a high level of our committee is really one of our agenda goals, is to introduce you to the committee, and that is 3D geomatics. And a lot of folks attending various NSGIC meetings have heard members of us, the Minnesota's 3D geomatics committee, talk about our group and our efforts. Certainly, covering culvert mapping to us, the road, the pathway is to elevation-derived hydrography has to involve culvert inventories. And that's why I'm so glad that Linda, brought to the forefront of her introduction there. Clint is going to be really focusing on Lake Superior watershed elevation-derived hydrography up in our northeastern portion along Lake Superior. And then utilizing and using breach lines. Rick will be covering some of this, and breach lines might be another new term. I didn't go into details to define that, but I'll say here and now, breach lines are to us a burn line to many who understand the process of lowering grid cell elevations across a road to facilitate water flow from one side to the other. And then certainly the discussion that I talked about earlier. So diving into really what brings us here today, and first and foremost is, like I said, I was going to cover an introduction to our committee. We are representatives from the Minnesota 3D Geomatics Committee. Right there, as it says on the right-hand side of your screen, is a committee really under the GAC, which is the Minnesota Geospatial Advisory Council. And we work to identify and promote the need for planning, funding, acquisition, and management of three-dimensional geomatic data and derived products. That's a typical mission statement that really leaves the door open to cover a lot of things, and gives us the freedom to manage, steer, and guide a lot of things related to the geospatial community and geospatial data. That being with an eye on the future and thinking about 3D data, point clouds, especially from LiDAR, but other products as well. What I want to do now is I want to bring your attention to what we call the Ferris wheel diagram here, just to help you a little bit understand the diversity of Minnesota 3D geomatics. What we've done is we have taken and we identified subject matter expertise and put them into sectors of application defined as work groups under the umbrella of the 3D Geomatics Committee. So we have a work group known as the hydrogeomorphology work group, and we're just going to go around the clock here. Hydrogeomorphology is really recognizing that the geomorphology of the landscape shaped by the water, movement of water in the landscape, erosive features and natural processes are captured by LiDAR. LiDAR captures those features. We can take those features and use them to build out derived hydrography. Recognizing that, we talk about LiDAR in particular as a 3D remotely sensed data product. It maps vegetation. We need education around this. Anytime you want to talk about, implement, and incorporate new data, especially new high density LiDAR data to folks, you need to recognize and incorporate the role of education. We recognize human infrastructure as a unique work group that really focuses on the built infrastructure. Think of buildings and also unique assets on the landscape and even archaeological sites. Emergency management is a consumer of the data. We don't have an active work group yet. We recognize that data governance is an important role for our committee to steer and guide and manage, disseminate, store 3D data. LiDAR in particular is our hot topic right now. Fish and Wildlife certainly has a role that is not an active working group for us. But the data acquisition work group is what a lot of folks within NSGIC and coming into meetings with us are familiar with. This is the group that is guiding this current generation of LiDAR data for the state of Minnesota. We manage this all through the executive steering team, which is kind of a core team. Each work group has a member on the executive steering team. This is kind of our information hub. And then we report quarterly to the Minnesota Geospatial Advisory Council that's shown here on the bottom. The thick circular ring here shows that we have coordination and communication across all of those work groups. I'm not going to step into this diagram here. I just wanted to really use this quickly to highlight that we can break this out, starting at the Minnesota Geospatial Advisory Council, which really represents the entirety of Minnesota's geospatial community. And that council has many committees underneath it. Of one, we are of one, and then so we have many work groups under the committee, and then we break up the work groups to the subgroups. So that's your important takeaway: is not understanding all of the verbiage that's here. This is for a reference if anyone would like it, but understanding that we have a committee that breaks out into work groups, and under that we have subgroups that focus on key subject content. So really going back to what that one slide says, what brings us here today is to share information and recognizing that we have culverts on the landscape. And I want to add that most people don't truly understand just how many culverts are on the landscape until you get in a car and go out there and drive around, look at them and look for them, and or look at them through using LiDAR data. Culvert inventories. So that goes hand in hand with understanding the culverts are everywhere in the landscape. And then LiDAR, DM hydro-modification, I'll be talking about coming up here next. And then all this steering towards elevation-derived hydrography. So we have this rich history of striving to tie all this together, which largely has been an unfunded effort because it's hard to get folks to understand how all of this has to tie together to use LiDAR in particular and mapped culverts to get to elevation-derived hydrography. One of the things that we wanted to bring to the forefront is an understanding of overcoming hurdles related to culvert inventories is always a challenge, no matter how you undertake this. In particular, because, and I'm going to skip the first bullet there, I just want to say that so many partners are committed to their own unique methods and culvert attributes. Which that means is we have people out there conducting culvert inventories who have special attributes, and they fail to realize, and what I want to tie in here is bullet number one, that the commonality that we all have, that we all share is first and foremost wondering and identifying where are culverts, culvert locations on the landscape. Once you identify a culvert accurately through geospatial technology, you can tag on any sort of attributes you want to it. The goal, though, is to really minimize the amount of visits, on-site visits to any one particular culvert that you would have to make. But we know, and we've learned, that we cannot send one person out to identify all of the unique features associated with any one given culvert because it takes different subject matter expertise. So our goal as geospatial technologists, first and foremost, is get the culvert location. That benefits everybody and starts off what is truly then a culvert location. And then certainly one of the things that we had to overcome is the paper versus the digital world. Yes, even in this day and age, we still had people committed to recording things like culvert inventories on paper. So we tried to bring them in to understand the efficiencies that we could build into the culvert app. And Rick Moore will be talking about that more as we come up. So moving right along here, then we understand that at least in regards to this conversation for elevation-derived hydrography from LiDAR, we have LiDAR acquisition from which we build a point cloud. And typically from that point cloud, you build the DEM. And digital elevation models have what I described in a term that I started back in 2004 is digital dams. Recognizing that there are impediments to the flow of water within the digital elevation model. And to us then, the term that you've already heard me mention, DEM hydro-modification. And what is it? Well, DEM hydro-modification is digital dam removal. You're overcoming those impediments to flow in the DEM. So let's cover this real quickly, just a few terms for you to carry through the rest of this presentation. Digital dams essentially disrupt the hydrologic connectivity and impede the ability of water to route through the DEM. What are they? Well, most of the time they're associated with the road infrastructure. That's the culverts. As most of us know, LiDAR does not capture and represent the flow of water from one side of the road to the other. But there's many other things out on the landscape. There's thousands of things out on the landscape. Water control structures, in particular dams, weirs, and bridges. There's also natural features, and Clint's going to be covering this a little bit. Beaver dams. In the northern Minnesota, we have hundreds and if not thousands and thousands of beaver dams that at least captured within a LiDAR-derived digital elevation model are impediment to flow. If a tree falls across a water course, it will be a digital dam in a LiDAR-derived DEM, and that must be overcome in one way or another to route water from one side of that down tree to the other. Otherwise, your DEM will fail in correctly routing the water. So there we go. DEM hydro-modification is related to digital dams. It is essentially removing digital dams. It's a digital elevation process that uses train analysis tools. Primarily, we're an Esri house, so we use Esri tools and other customized tools to modify LiDAR-derived raster cell elevation Z values. We are lowering the values, and that's why we call it hydro-modification, because we're modifying the LiDAR-derived DEM for hydrologic purposes. So let's take a look at this. This is one of my last slides for my section here. Let's take a look at what is a digital dam. I want to orientate your mind here to understand that we have a road running north and south, and we have then a ditch that comes into and intersects with that road. And so there would be a culvert right here, and the ditch continues on over here. So this is a digital dam. That road right there is a digital dam. There's many digital dams. This is a field approach. This is a field approach. That's a field approach. All of those are digital dams. All of those need to be negotiated, interpreted, and modified to allow water to route from one side to the other. As we follow this ditch over here to the right-hand side of the screen, this then is a breached digital dam. We have essentially removed the impediment of flow represented by that digital dam. So I hope that really helps you understand a couple of the terms that you can hear in the rest of the presentation. And now is where I will stop sharing. I turn it over to Rick, and he's going to carry the presentation forward until the end.
Thanks, Sean. Let's see. I'm just getting set up here as well. Apologize for the transition, but it works best for us to run our own slides here. And do you guys see my screen? Okay.
Looks good.
All right, thank you. So I'm just going to move ahead. My name is Rick Moore. I'm a JS analyst on the LiDAR and watershed steward here. I focus on DEM hydro-modification, so I'm taking these culverts, using them to create breach lines, and we'll talk about that more here. And then from that, we hydro-modified that DEM to create flow paths, create that elevation-derived hydrography. So in terms of this presentation, it's kind of, encompasses everything. So culverts is what I'll start talking about now, and kind of our work we've done at the Minnesota DNR, which is the Department of Natural Resources, and then also we're Minute at DNR. So we are technical people in one of the state agencies that work with the DNR. We partner with them. So, but just maybe just a brief history. Sean said he's been doing DEM hydro-modification for a good almost 25 years now. And back when we had our first our LiDAR collect from about 2008 to 2012, they knew that eventually we're going to have to hydro-modify those DMs, so they create an interim guidance on the acquisition of culvert geospatial data in anticipation of knowing that we're going to have to hydro-modify those DMs. So you can kind of see in the back side of that picture some of the attributes, and then on the right there is just a representation of those attributes based on like the field and then the attributes that are available for that. So brief history there. Also brief history is at the Minnesota DNR, we have hydrologists, fisheries people that go out and collect data on these culverts. A lot of times looking at if it's a perched culvert, preventing fish passage. So as we look, these are paper forms that they were using back when. So they would go out and collect that information, and it would come back to the office, and whether it went into a database or if they just used it for their own work. We felt that it's important to create maybe a digital version of this. And one thing I want to highlight is on these forms, they focus on a single crossing, and I'll talk about that in a little more detail. And then from that full crossing, we look at the openings, the culvert inlet and outlet of that. So paper form to collector app. So we wanted to be able to have the ability to simultaneously collect culvert locations across the state. We have staff within the DNR that can do that. But we also look at crowdsourcing, and I'll have a second here to kind of show a slide on that, and a standardized manner to build a statewide database of those culvert features. And those are the 5 things that we kind of focus on. Last one is the one we focus on, but a lot of our DNR staff look at many of the other structures there, or many of the other purposes there. And we wanted that standardized attributes. So if people go in, they're kind of, I shouldn't say forced, but they have that choice of the set of attributes that are in there. So we can have a standardized database, and it's not, we don't need to go in and clean it up. So these did bring efficiencies to the process. We wanted to reduce the data entry time using tablets, minimize that human error by forcing those domains, and then really making that data available in real time. So if you're directly connected to the internet out in the field, it'd be available instantaneously. Otherwise, when you come back to the office, it does get uploaded and it's available as soon as that connection is made. So as I said, we are trying to leverage that crowdsourcing with 87 counties, 45 watershed districts, 90 soil and water conservation districts, and then multiple state agencies, mostly the DNR here and our Board of Water and Soil Resources. We also have a pollution control agency, which could also be another state agency. So by all, 100, 200 different potential entities here, they can all be collecting the data at once. So this is kind of a structure of this application suite. The first one starts with really a centralized database. We have a place to store that data. From that, prior to that, we need a way to collect that data. And this slide is a little bit old. It's ArcGIS Field Maps mobile application. That's really to go out in the field, use that Field Maps application, collect the information, have it go back to that centralized database, and then we can it feeds into a DNR web application that we can view those points that we collected, and also, and we'll get into more detail, is actually review those points and then approve them. So, and finally, we can publish those to the statewide GIS layers. We have a place called the Geospatial Commons here in Minnesota, where a lot of our GIS data goes. It's housed by the Minnesota Geographic Information Office. And they get published there so people can actually go out and grab those. So as I said, we use ArcGIS Field Maps, and we focus on collecting a single point called the crossing that focuses on the information of how many culverts are underneath there, what's the span of the culverts. This is actually the culvert opening one. And then we create a culvert inlet and outlet and tie those information together. So you could actually have multiple culverts in here. So you'd have multiple points here, and we would say a pipe ID of 1, 2, 3, depending on how many culverts. So that's how we focus on that. And I'll show here in a second, and this is probably what a lot of people are interested in, is if you think of the data dictionary, the metadata, what are we collecting? So a lot of these features, if you look at the feature name, the alias, those are focused off of our stream crossing form, the form that we saw earlier. We kind of took that information, transferred into a digital form, and we have a couple different forms in the field maps, the short form or a long form, and then this is just the order if it's in the SDE or the web app. But we do have a feature type, we have a feature length, the domain name if we want to set up domains, what type it is, and then those domain values. So we set the structure for that, so it's standardized database. So this is the crossings database, and then this is the culvert opening database. So size span, size rise, opening shape, a lot of information that a lot of people are collecting. We can make this available to any state or any group that wants to look at our metadata. All the metadata that's currently on our Geospatial Commons is reflective of this. And I'll talk to you in a second about, we're looking at a culvert data standard here, and I'll get to that here in a second. So I said that we have a web application, and crossing points are assigned an ID, and those culvert openings and outlets are associated with that crossing. So we can create a candidate, which is the very first point that's collected. Somebody can come in and review it, and then it gets approved as well. So, and again, as I said, it kind of works through the process. So we have a verification that the information was collected correctly. So we have a field person, we have a reviewer, and then it gets approved by the business for that related use. In relation to that, we're also looking at currently what we call our GAC priorities. Our GAC is our Geospatial Advisory Council. This is the priority that's been identified by GIS and other staff within Minnesota. It's a priority, so it's a culvert data standard. If we're looking at a way to share data across the geospatial communities and support the development of a future statewide culvert inventory. So what we're currently working towards is looking at all the culvert attributes that are collected by multiple different groups, such as different counties, the ones that the DNR collect, and really, I don't know, should I parsing it down to a set of attributes that we feel is important for that statewide database. Not that any entity couldn't collect more than they want, as the DNR does collect quite a few different attributes for that feature, but this would bring it down into a set of attributes that we feel are important in the state to put into that database. So at that point, I will come back here in a second. I'll talk about DM hydro-modification and breach lines and how that's going to tie to those culvert locations. And I think that's kind of important as we move towards that EDH. So I am going to step out of my slide presentation, and Clint will take over. Clint, I'm not sure if you're on mute. We can't hear you currently.
You're talking to Clint, right?
Yeah, I can't hear
Okay.
Clint yet.
Can you tell we work in a Teams environment every day, all day long?
Totally understand working in a Zoom environment and having to work in teams. So
A lot of times with our headsets, we have to sometimes hit a second button to get it to connect. So,
and just to reiterate, what are these still your slides, Rick?
no, Clint does have his set of slides up.
There
There we go.
Apologize. After I started sharing, all the Teams windows went away and I couldn't find the unmute. Yes, so my name is Clinton Little. I'm a coastal program specialist working under Minnesota Department of Natural Resources on Minnesota's Lake Superior Coastal Program. We are funded by the Coastal Zone Management Act, and we're referred to as a networked coastal program. So we take advantage of our existing agencies and policies, and really spend a lot of time networking with folks. And so I kind of work my way into a lot of projects in a liaison role. And during 2015, 2016, we were working with our Minnesota Pollution Control Agency on a watershed restoration and protection strategy project, or what we call RAPS. And they were looking for LiDAR-derived data to help inform their analysis. And these protection strategies go through a lot of field work, a lot of in-field analysis, a lot of mapping. And so we felt that we could use Coastal Zone Management Act funding to really help launch a pilot in updating some of the hydrography data. And we also tied into the Lake Superior Lake-wide Area Management Plan, or what we've referred to the LAMP, and the Habitat Coordinator, John Jurassic, who's under, also works for Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Oh, sorry about that. I was scrolling down in my notes and I took a big jump. I wanted to just kind of get you a little familiar with some of the uniqueness of this area. Our coastal area features approximately 2,000 named and unnamed tributaries to Lake Superior. 90% or 95% of our pre-settlement wetlands still exist in this coastal area. And our land ownership is comprised of about 49% public lands, which includes federal and state and county lands. I'm kind of lumping those together. 7% tribal and 39% private lands. And some of the private lands for this type of work can often, for your field work, can often get in the way of access to property to get your culvert inventory. What we launched was pretty ambitious at the time, and I look back at it and remember that's probably when my hair turned gray. We included a red clay soils steep bank analysis to map out our potential erosion hotspots, update the current 1 to 24,000 scale hydro layer is what it was referred to in planning. Compile existing culvert inventories to aid with this update work, and conduct other inventories in these priority watersheds. So as we were working, we had people collecting collecting culvert inventory also. Also, we did some pilot studies on delineating riparian areas and move that into a riparian area health assessment. We had projects of Minnesota, or partners of the under Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, the office based out of Duluth, that we're working on at the Huck 8 scale watersheds that I've highlighted kind of in the red there on the map, and different areas of the Minnesota DNR, the coastal program, our Lake Spear Habitat Coordinator who was working on the LAMP, the Minnesota DNR Office or Resource Assessment, that's where our remote sensing specialists are housed, and the Geospatial Water Resource Team. This is a team of DNR experts in geospatial water resources data, which includes Sean and Rick. It was really nice to have Sean with all of his experience to tell the staff working on this project to go to Sean for advice. So what I'm going to just kind of focus here though is that update of the stream course data or water course data. What we were experiencing in a lot of our field work where the existing data didn't line up with the stream channels in aerial photography. And you can imagine if you're working with something that was mapped at a 1 to 24,000 scale, working at a local level, some of the first things people would point out is, hey, your stream is running through my house, or it doesn't lay in the stream banks. That was, one of the cosmetic issues that we were dealing with. So we used a lot of the LiDAR derived products to help get the detail of these hydrographic features. What we're looking at here is something Sean Vaughn developed, a hydrologic position index, which helped inform a lot of our work. And we were able to take a look at how those current inventories weren't lining up with what we were seeing on the landscape. And then went through the DEM enforcement that Sean was just talking about earlier to provide more detail on these stream inventories. And our analysis went beyond just the existing data and included other contributing flows into our existing line work. And it started to be a bit of a eye-opener as some of these tributaries that previously weren't mapped were starting to show up for us. We had to do a lot of running for digital dam source data. I won't go through the full list here, but this was an exercise of really leveraging your teams or other work groups that you're part of. And everybody was already talking about gathering this type of data. And the advantage of our coastal program being a pass-through grant program, we were able to fund a lot of these inventories. So some of the culvert inventories were preloaded for us. And in some cases, like St. Louis County, Minnesota, they were doing survey level culvert inventories at the highway department level. Overall, with information that we were able to collect from inventories, and then using aerial imagery and other remote sensing techniques, we were able to tease out other natural features, beaver dams, felled trees, culverts that aren't inventoried, or bridges that aren't inventoried, stormwater infrastructure across the landscape that hasn't been inventoried yet, and even some of these sports fields. Baseball diamonds in our work area were a particular headache, which required some on-site visits too. Overall, we accumulated 13,142 digital dam breach lines that were created from this work, and it was amazing, because at the beginning that was not a number I thought we would approach. Just a quick summary of the methods used by our remote sensing specialist, and who was working with Sean Vaughn to develop this process, using arc hydro for the enforcement of the digital dam breach lines, and then doing the stream analysis in tau DEM, and kind of keeping us down to that 1,000 meter threshold for our stream reaches. And this is just to hit again on the specific data need, that we were looking at updating the current DNR 24K stream and river centerline data set. And the initial analysis output provided a lot more information than we were expecting. And so we had to go back, constantly going back to our original goal of updating the existing 1 to 24,000 scale streamlines, but not deleting all of this input data. This we kind of keep that as reference information for future work. And so our remote sensing folks went into representing the concentrated flow, which you'll see kind of in the middle there. There's one tributary that wasn't included in what we used as the updated data, because we were focusing solely on that 1 to 24,000 scale update. And as we move forward, this is just, again, Sean mentioned, one of the difficulties we had is in flow analysis were beaver dams or backwater areas. These features often were updated by hand after some analysis using photos and the LiDAR digital elevation models. And this is just a comment. I think everybody knows that the streams are a dynamic feature, and in the future, topography LiDAR is going to be really helpful on our stream mapping, but also keeping in mind that line work we develop today is very susceptible to going out of date. And then if we look here, this is a section of the lower Knife River, just before it crosses Minnesota Highway 61, which is an expressway, and then enters Lake Superior. This is an area where there used to be a logging rail line that crossed up there, and they tried to make the stream flow at a right angle, and it's been trying to find its equilibrium ever since. And this is one area where we notice a lot of changes in stream channel from our work over time, and we can look back at aerial photo history to inform us also. Pass it off to Rick, I believe.
Yep. Thanks, Clint. If you wanna, I'll start sharing my screen again. and go into presentation mode here. There we go. All right, so as we talked about earlier, culvert mapping is informing a lot of our work of taking that DEM, modifying it so that we can actually create that elevation-derived hydrography. So as you can see on the screen, kind of what we always call the breach line. It's a line we draw. It could come from a culvert. A lot of times we feel that the culvert needs to be extended. We actually have a tool that if we have a inlet and outlet, we can tell it to extend it a couple extra feet, meters, depending on the structure that we want to use in terms of our DEM that we're using. So I'll just jump ahead here. So within Minnesota, and this is going to be one of our common themes throughout this, is partnerships in Minnesota. Partnerships because there's a lot of data across your states, across Minnesota. And if we don't start talking about the information that we have, we won't necessarily know what everybody has available. So we talk about that standard. That's looking out to all our 87 counties and entities and finding what they have and what they need. So, but within our subgroup, we have been meeting for about 4 years now. It's our subject matter experts that have been focusing on that hydro-modification. So they're taking those DEMs and creating breach lines, what we call from culverts or from heads-up digitizing, and creating that DEM that is hydrologically able to create flow lines and be used in our work. If you ever heard of ACPF, the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework, you could use the breach lines for that to identify those conservation practices. As a group, we also develop standards, kind of methodology and protocol in this process, and so we're trying to create that standardized process across Minnesota. We all kind of were doing very similar things, but we're all kind of doing it just a little bit differently. We wanted to create a similar methodology and protocol for that. And because we have these breach lines, we want to create one breach line data set, one breach line database for the future, and we'll talk about that in more detail. And we support those public and private business needs. Somebody asked that question. We are focusing on private business needs as well. So the data that we collect of these breach lines can be used for hydrologic modeling, such as a couple of our tools we have in the state, PTMap and ACPF. So I want to kind of focus on this a little bit, and I think some states may have, if they've done, hydrologic modification, hydro conditioning, they may have data sets out there that were created that are maybe sitting on a hard drive somewhere. Within Minnesota, we have a clean water fund that helps fund a lot of these collections across the state. So with help from one of our members from Bowser and some of our private entities that do the work, we actually went and pulled together all those breach lines across the state. So as you can see on the right, that's this picture of our state. That's the number of database breach lines that we have. And we could do a couple of different things. We have a confidence of that breach line that it's actually going to get the flow across the landscape, across the culvert. And then the completeness of those breach lines for that watershed to say that we have the necessary number of breach lines within that watershed to create the flow that's correct in it. This also helps us look at the data extent and where we need to focus maybe some funds in the future and work areas. So this has helped what we call Bowser, our water and soil resources, which tend to fund a lot of these projects, areas that maybe they're going to target in the future. So this map is about 2 years old. We still have some more data sets to add to this. And this is just a zoomed in view of it. We have, I think, currently have between 500,000 and 700,000 breach lines. So as we always say, every culvert is a breach line, but not every breach line is a culvert. So if we have a downed tree in the DEM that creates an artifact, or we kind of have to create a breach line to cut across that. So it's not just the culverts in the landscape, it's features in the landscape, such as I talked about beaver dams. We need to create a structure to that. There's no necessarily culvert there, but water does eventually flow through there. But we want to cut through that to get that water to flow correctly. So this is just a small Huck 12 within our state, but there are quite a few breach lines in that data set. So, but we also know that we can do a culvert inventory, but within our new LiDAR collects that we have been doing from about the last 2019, 2020 through now, and maybe in the near future, is we're seeing those culverts in the landscape in that DEM, and we're able to actually heads up digitize those features. So this is our previous 1 meter DEM. We can kind of see a feature maybe there. This is our 3 meter version of that. Not great. This is a 30 points per square meter LiDAR collect in one of our counties, and you can actually see that feature in the landscape. This is a different part of our state that has 8 points per square meter. Would probably be considered a QL1, but you can actually identify those culverts within that database, within that DEM. So we actually are able to draw those as well. So we kind of do a dual. Yes.
I'm sorry, I've got an end. Can everybody hear okay? Just hey, yeah. I mean, I can hear fine.
Yep.
Okay, I'm getting some message. I got a message from someone who's having trouble. I just want to make sure it wasn't the team, that everybody was still having problems. Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Great. I usually have high speed internet, so I'm good. Feedback is happening. Excuse me. Maybe I'll speak. So this is just a representation of what we see in that aerial photo there. So we're kind of, as I talked about, in tandem, collecting culverts with our application suite, as well as other entities collecting those. But we're also doing work that actually does heads up digitizing, creating those features from a DEM that has this high resolution. So, and we've done a little bit of work of using those existing breach lines with our high resolution. So these breach lines we have in that database were created on the original 1 meter or 3 meter. We're now working to see how well they work with the high resolution, see how much we have to adjust those breach lines to make those work. We're finding that about 95% of those breach lines create the flow correctly when you have a higher resolution DM. But we're finding that there's a lot more culverts or breach lines in that high resolution DM that we're identifying as well. So it's probably about 40% more breach lines we're finding. So, and just we're creating lessons learned and best practices from that. So just an example of that, the red line is the new adjusted breach line, the black and white is the existing. And we can see that over here, a couple of the original, there's only the black one here, didn't correctly flow. So flow should be correctly coming down across here where the purple was the original legacy, filled up, overflowed here, but it actually should have flowed through there. So just a couple examples of taking our breach lines and making sure that they work with the existing data. Eventually, that will inform that elevation-derived hydrography. So we just have a few takeaway messages from this, is that those legacy breach lines support that hydro-modification work with the second generation LiDAR data we have, and eventually that EDH. LiDAR does its job. It's not the flaw of LiDAR, it's just that we can't see those culverts in landscape. We need that proper replication of hydrology in the DEMs, and we feel hydro-modified DEMs are foundational data, and the business need is dependent on removing those. So, and if Sean wants to jump in here, I'll leave this slide up here, but this is pretty much our last slide here. If he has any closing remarks on this. As we talked about, partnerships, I think, are most important when we're doing this type of work. Seek those existing culvert inventories, spread out, send out what we call a gov delivery, send it out to those GIS staff within the state. Maybe somebody's up in the northern Minnesota that has a data set that we don't know about. By creating those partnerships, we can find where that data is, pull it in, and make it work. So, and then a couple lessons learned is what maybe Clint had talked about is once we get that new line work, is it always a one-to-one transfer of data from our original data set, our 24K or streams that we have within the Minnesota DNR, trying to transfer that data across that's tied to those lines. It's not always a great one-to-one transfer because we're finding that the lines, the length may be longer. And a lot of times if you use GIS, you're creating events along that stream. And now that it's a longer stream, that event may not be where it's supposed to be in the landscape. So those are some things we're kind of working through, trying to figure out. And I'm sure that's many of the entities on this call are thinking about that as well. So, Sean, do you want to jump in and have any comments here at the end?
Well, just something that Clint and you mentioned earlier, just to capitalize on here, the heading there, partnerships. There was a question in the chat that asked about, is DNR only interested in like state culvert or DNR culverts? I think I might be changing the question, but I'll add to that by saying that an important lesson learned is that entities are concerned about their assets. So if it's different government levels, for example, concerned about culverts that they inventory and not so much about a culvert that's not associated with their asset. So a case in point is in my own area here, East Central Minnesota. I was driving to work one day and my county, Chisago County, was out collecting a culvert inventory. That's a great opportunity for me to pull over and have a chat with them. That technician's truck was parked on above a culvert, essentially, that he had no interest in. And he was taking a measurement of a culvert as part of the culvert inventory. Now, what they lacked is the understanding of the true hydrology of the landscape. Whereas if you don't map all of the culverts and you don't map information about those culverts, you can't fully understand or appreciate the volume of water routing to any one given culvert. And that's so important in this day and age when we really think about resiliency. Resiliency is understanding really the impacts of these large rain events that our country is experiencing. How are our culverts going to manage and mitigate that flow? And that's why we see a lot of roads being washed out. So the case in point, to go back to the scenario that I was describing, is we had a county entity not interested in the culverts that they were near and even parked over. It would have taken that person really probably 5 minutes to inventory that culvert, but that is not what he's paid to do. And he got in his truck and drove away. And so then you have to build all of those partnerships to then go to the township or whoever else may have been interested in mapping that culvert and send someone back out to map that. So a very important takeaway. And that's why that list was so extensive that Clint showed earlier. So that's something I wanted to bring up. And then one of the things that just capitalize on what Rick said there about attribution and conflation. We know very well that when you drive hydrography from LiDAR, it is just line work. It's just a vector product at that time. In order to make it usable, and fit into the business needs of various agencies, entities, engineering firms, the universities, the list goes on and on and on. You have to put the brains into it. And agencies like us in the state of Minnesota, we have all of these attributes that are attached to existing lines and line work. We have to port them over somehow. But we also have to take out the hydrologic bias, as I like to explain, remove the hydrologic bias of the historical data, meaning revisit what does it mean in this point in time today as we drive LiDAR, drive hydrography, create LiDAR, drive hydrography, I should say. What can we do to evaluate old classifications of watercourses, that being ephemeral, intermittent, and perennial? Because those features out there may be conveying water that they didn't in the 1960s, like in the state of Minnesota when some of our products were inventoried. So it just goes along with understanding attribution, bringing all of those key partners in and understanding what attributes are important and which attributes need to be updated, because you may not need to conflate all attributes over onto the new line work. And then just what Rick has there for good leaf off imagery is certainly such a key component in supporting all this work and understanding culverts. And as Rick identified earlier, we're really seeing the benefit of high density, highly accurate LiDAR data for providing information to where culverts are. We are expediting culvert inventory. We will be expediting culvert inventory for sure in the state of Minnesota with new high density quality level 1 LiDAR. So just a couple things there that came to my mind. I think that was our end of our presentation, right, Rick?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
So Linda, we could go through any questions within the chat at this time, or whatever comes next.
That sounds good. I've been capturing them, so let's start at the very beginning. I think you already answered the question about the membership of the 3D Geomatics group, but if you want to just elaborate on that you are more than just a public entity.
Yeah, I certainly can. I blew through that. I was really concerned about time. I didn't cover really. I should have what really comprises our group. But we certainly are represented by members, both from the public and private, nonprofit as well, educational institutions. That's the beauty of here in Minnesota, and I think a lot of states across the country, where we really recognize that in modern times, the geospatial community is wide and expansive and very diverse. 20 years ago, there wasn't a lot of us out there. And we now, as a profession, infiltrate so many different professions that when we build a community of practice or a committee like this, we really benefit from bringing those folks on board. And in the diversity of 3D Geomatics is really understanding that we can't have one committee that meets and brings 100 people together. That's why we broke it out into work groups to capitalize on those sectors of subject matter expertise. They operate under one charter, which is the 3D Geomatics charter, but each work group has its own mission, and they run their own meetings and agenda and topics, and it builds that community practice for communication across the board in Minnesota.
All right, question from MB. I'm not sure who that is, and if you want to come off the line, but this is an earlier question. Looking for suggested workflows other than what's provided in the ESRI documentation to get more accurate watersheds.
Well,
to go on, they say my daily workflow does not include working directly with LiDAR as other vendors provides this. I work on processing the raster data only.
Well, I'll start off by saying certainly what you saw here today from our presentation is historically anyway, much of our work is on the digital elevation model, going from the point cloud to the DEM. And that's why I'm really excited about new LiDAR, high density, quality level 1 LiDAR data, expediting that process like Rick has on the screen. One of the most important things that I think goes along with one of those questions I saw, if that's not, that might be the same question, Linda, is really understanding that the workflows, there's a lot of similarities to the workflows like that anyone could use, like Rick mentioned, but the most important takeaway is that no matter what workflow you use, no matter what buttons you push and what tools you implement, you really can't take the human element completely out of it. You have to go in, you have to review the data, you have to have understanding of the landscape, and you have to see where has the derived flow lines from the process exited or left the water conveyance features. I always say that LiDAR captures the water conveyance features of Earth's landscape, and we have the ability to put the flow lines within those water conveyance features. If the flow lines are outside of those water conveyance features, you're at risk then for routing water, oftentimes not only into, right out of the watershed of interest and routing it into an adjacent watershed. And now all of your hydrology, all of your modeling is suspect. So a word of caution there is really just be aware that there's no silver bullet in the country that I'm aware of that you push and make this all happen. It really is about understanding the tools you're implementing and understanding the landscape and keeping the human element in there for conducting heads up on-screen review. And yes, sometimes we still may need to go out in the field and review a critical area. As good as our geospatial data is, remotely sensed products these days, I think it's always important to get out in a vehicle and drive around and understand what you're trying to model. I don't know if that answers it, but hopefully.
Linda, can I add one thing to that?
Please do.
So, the culvert mapping, the whole idea of that is a XY location, maybe a Z location as well, but just to inform us where there is a culvert there. In our work here, as you see on the screen, all those little red or black arrows are breach lines we've created. And we do painstakingly look at each, we kind of do a section by section within our state, looking at that. We tend to use some tools. We tend to use ACPF. There's a couple of tools in ACPF that help us kind of group together tools within the S-Series product. So it creates the flow direction, flow accumulation, and produces breach lines from that. So it helps us do that process quicker. But we do look at the whole watershed and run it through. We also talk about DM hydro-modification is depression analysis. We know there are natural depressions on the landscape, but a lot of times those digital dams create those depressions. So we look at those places where there's impeded flow. And once we've kind of identified that for maybe a watershed or a section, we kind of feel that that is kind of complete in a way. And we kind of continue on, if we're looking at a HUC 8, do that HUC 8, and eventually go back and look at everything again to make sure that we're identifying all of the breach lines or the locations where we need to actually breach that landscape so that the water flows correctly. So if MB, you could contact us directly if you have more questions. I lead the subgroup, so we have a lot of information that we still need to publish on this, but we do have some workflows on that we can work with you on.
If I could hop on this one too. The discontinuous streams and obstructions brought back memories for me on our work, and I would get messages back from our remote sensing staff with certain problem areas that led to engagement with certain groups. I was thinking, reserve mining has an area with severely altered hydrology around a tailings pond, and the model wasn't working around there. And working with reserve mining to get their culvert inventory, they actually sent staff out to do it for me and sent me the data. So I think really leveraging your networks. When you leverage your networks, you're going to talk to people that don't think they have geospatial data. I used one community with an MS4 Excel spreadsheet with XY coordinates for their culvert, just basically, road center line above the culvert, and they map or they put the beginning and ending of some of their ditches that they manage as part of their municipal stormwater permit. And, that helped us target some areas also. So you will run in, another one was our Superior Hiking Trail Association maintained a bridge inspection database that they didn't think of that could be useful, but talking with their staff, we were able to identify that also as a resource for bridges that would have obstructed also. So it was a good question. It brought back memories.
Memory. Roger, I don't believe Roger's on the call anymore, but he did make a note about District of Columbia is almost complete with their project. And we as a group, as a project, will be sure to follow up and get as much information as we can. Roger's also involved in some work trying to look at, as you guys did, a common set of attributes, a minimal set of attributes. So I think that dialogue will definitely continue. Cindy had a question about the inventory being state-owned culvert structures. I think you've addressed this, but Rick, you replied back in the chat if you want to elaborate on that, that the inventory is for any entity.
Yeah, so I want to add to that the fact that so we make the application available to anybody that wants to use it. We also realize they have a business need themselves, and could be a county which wants to look at all culverts maybe on their county roads, or looking at all culverts. So that may be trying to think of the right word, error to this type of work, that we don't force everybody to do everything in their county or in their area. We're letting them use it for their business data. So we're actually getting culvert data from them, but we're not forcing them to do culvert. You can't say, oh, you're going to do the HUC 12 and you do everything in that HUC 12. We feel that anything we get from them is important in this process.
Yeah,
so
it's
I think
very much
that
a layer cake based on me, whether it's road authorities, trail authorities, railroad authorities. Cindy also kind of asked about U.S. Forest Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife inventories. We did have access to and reference the U.S. Fish and Wildlife passage barrier data. and we still use that currently in coastal management when people are looking for on the ground shovel ready projects for improving fish passage. And the US Forest Service did share their data in our project. And then in a recent Cook County, Minnesota culvert update to their culvert inventory, which is using this same process, the US Forest Service worked with Cook County so they didn't duplicate efforts. So US Forest Service does share their culvert inventory with us on request. And but I don't think it's included in the current culvert inventory data portal at this time. I could be wrong. I'd have to double check that.
Sean, I appreciate your explanation using the term breach line. I didn't know if you wanted to take a minute to address that.
Well, sure. We heard today also the use of cut and cut lines, and you know, since there really hasn't been a nationwide community of practice focused on the subject of modifying DEMs for the purposes that we've talked about here today, there's no single go-to entity for terminology, and what we need is terminology that folks outside of our geospatial community can understand. And as I put it in the chat, there's a good example is writing a grant, for example, or if you're just going to go talk to your superiors and propose a project. If you talk about burning in something to a DEM, first it might be people who don't understand it yet know or what a digital elevation model is, and now you're talking about burning it. And then they're going to, maybe they should talk about a safety feed, have a safety message along with it, because there's a flame involved. When in reality is no, and we really probably should change our terminology to help folks better understand the process. And that's why years and years and years ago, I settled on breaching and breach lines is associated more closely with the words dams, digital dams, and folks understand then that we are doing something to it. And water is coming from one side to the other. That's a breach.
All right, very good. MB also asked, what did you use to add the cut lines and extend the lines?
Yeah, so we found, I'll start the first part of that, so that we just create using, I tend to use Pro now. So we're just creating features, creating a first point, end point, just those 2 points. And really then the tools, like if we use ACPF, it just looks at the minimum elevation method on that. So it looks for the cell that's the lowest along that line. So we need to make sure we extend it long enough when we are looking at that DM, so that the water is going to flow correctly across there and not create another small digital dam or another depression in there. So if we do get culvert data that has an inlet and outlet, sometimes we feel in the DM it doesn't fully breach that whole area. There was a tool that was created I shouldn't say many years, but probably about 10 years ago, which we call stretch culverts. So what it does is that it takes that line, it figures out the angle it is, and then it tells it to extend it by a certain amount that you put into that tool. So if we say extend it 2 meters or 1 meter, 3 meters, we can also do that by hand, but sometimes if you have a set of culverts from someone, you can just stretch them, and then once you stretch them, run that through the tool, and then you can actually go back and review each of them separately. Maybe they'll work, but instead of extending every single one, you can actually just adjust the ones that need to be adjusted. So a little bit of techniques we're doing. So I feel we may be able to share that extend the lines tool with you. Just send us the email on that. So
Excellent. All right, the Phil Worrell questions are piling up, so let's start with that.
I think I'll let Sean take those.
Phil asked, are you still focusing EDH development just on 25K hydro details? And if so, how do you address the original NHD mapping inconsistencies in the 24K mapping? For example, the quad-to-quad differences in NHD detail map. Also, what are you doing with all of the other streams and details you are generating?
Yeah, it's a good question, Phil, and it is a complicated question. I'm gonna start maybe just with the easy approach and saying that what Clint covered earlier, describing the work along Lake Superior there was really an effort that had a very specific business need and only a certain amount of funding to cover all of the costs. And so the focus there was largely to improve the hydrologic extent of the original 1 to 24,000 K features. But as Clint illustrated, there's a lot of other features there. And that's really what you're getting at as well as part of that question. And so my answer typically comes in and says that one of the things I want to do for the future of mapping hydrography is wipe the slate clean. In the state of Minnesota, and I think there's a lot of states like us, at least historically, our authoritative hydrologic data that represents watercourses in general comes from approximately the 1960s, with edits from all of the decades since. And that's a problem, as Clint highlighted earlier, where features just do not match up. That's why we need to really wipe the slate clean and not really worry about what happens when we're going from one quad to the next. For example, the geospatial mechanisms and stuff that we've talked about here today really alleviate that. And so we call it next generation hydrography. It's an unfunded effort here in the state of Minnesota, but we have to keep pushing on this as we educate decision makers. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about seeing a national program being developed and NSGIC rallying behind it with support and building that community of practice. So where do I come in on this, and what is my perspective? As a hydrologist who has studied the landscape for 3 decades, I want to map everything. I want to know where water starts from the beginnings of concentrated flow. I'm not talking about overland flow or sheet flow, but where erosive features have created a water conveyance landform on Earth's landscape that has been captured by LiDAR. I want to start there. I want to map that all the way through until it reaches essentially the Gulf of Mexico or flows into Manitoba or Lake Superior, as Clint was illustrating. That way, we take out all of the hydrologic bias. Hydrologic bias to me is where any one entity mapping a feature stops, because that's where their business need stops. What we have to realize is that we need hydrologic data that essentially meets everybody's needs, not hinged on how much money is available to create any one product. We have to find the money available to map it all. You map it all, and then you start putting attributes into it, and then you have the ability to come in, piece out, pull out, and attribute different chunks of it, different areas of it. But the source product is mapping the water conveyance features on Earth's landscape, from my perspective. And that's what would happen if I was king, but I'm not there yet. Does that help, Phil?
Absolutely. Great answer. Thanks.
Can I add to that a little bit on what happened with the features in the mapping? We kept them all. And if you were to download the geodatabase from the Minnesota Geospatial Commons, all of those line features are still there. There's some layer files that tease out just so you have the existing 24K lines there. And that hydrologic bias at the time was, as I think back, a lot of it was influenced by the streams that MPCA were involved in investigating for their RAPS process. And I don't, I was thinking of the questions like, what surprised you? How much line work we got out of that, and how much detail there was. And it's one thing to do differently on that project would bring in more people early on, but also we were limited with our grant of a 15-month time span to knock a bunch of this out. We were able to extend the grant for the riparian assessment. The work moving on from there, this data is still is being used to inform DNR staff and Nature Conservancy staff who are doing riparian area planting to protect trout habitat. So, so the work is still being used to inform work on, or that work is being used to inform habitat restoration on the ground.
Yeah, so on the screen, I have our link to the data, but I think Phil also put it out on a one of the stories. I can't remember what you call it, Phil.
Yeah, it's one of the case studies. I added it onto the map, so it's on our hub.
Mhm.
Great. Phil, do you want to, you're asking about the linear address dynamic changes in line work and how they're dealing with updates and changes over time?
Yeah, you mentioned that obviously the address is changed as the geometry changes. How are you dealing with that?
We're not yet.
Okay, well, we aren't either. So I was,
Yeah, and our NHD data steward at least was on the meeting earlier, Jen Korea from Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. But Phil, really in the state of Minnesota, we have two approaches to mapping watercourses. We have two data sets. We have a DNR data set, and then we have NHD, where the state agencies who have funding requirements tied back to the federal sources rely more on NHD. In an ideal world, as we move forward, and we've explored this in the past, is really just having one single data product. And to me, stepping into a elevation-derived hydrography product would be a good point in time to have a state like Minnesota that has multiple data sets, really having one. Because I always like to say that LiDAR really brings harmonization to mapping features on the landscape. In the state of Minnesota, we map our lakes, wetlands, and water courses, and they come from different lineages over the decades. And so a lot of it doesn't line up. It doesn't stack. It doesn't sit side by side. And that really, it's becoming more and more of a problem, especially I feel in the eyes of the citizen. I've spent much of my career working out of a field office. The average citizen nowadays has a lot of information in the palm of their hand with their phone. They have current imagery and can even get at data sets. And they expect us as agencies to have all of this mapped and have all of it lined up and in harmonization. And largely, at least in the case of Minnesota, that's not the case. So LiDAR to me is the one of the most fundamental foundational data products that will stitch together all of this in harmonization.
All right, and Jamie's adding in the chat that the Minnesota fishery uses the stream layer and stores the UTM collection. So I'm going to add Jamie's comment to the notes. Phil, last note, and then we'll get quickly back to one more slide where we talk about what's coming up. So Phil had a question. Phil, which work groups in Minnesota have identified the existing project? Do you want to just say your question, Phil, or do you want me to say it for you?
I can. Whoops. Yeah, you can hear me. Okay. Yeah. You said you were unfunded for this collection. So how do you go about identifying the project opportunities to and then once you do identify them, how do you convince the folks to participate?
Well, really, I think the model, Phil, is really what we've done with 3DEP, where we've established a community of practice. We've conducted a lot of outreach, a lot of education. You start to build that momentum. You target all levels of government, all levels of citizenship if needed, and start to build an understanding of the need and understanding of the technology. Then you look for ways to leverage funding, much the way 3DEP did. That's why I'm really encouraged about 3DHP and just paralleling that effort as best we can. That's my goal. I certainly have a lot more colleagues that are involved, and but that's, well, I don't know. I guess I don't know what else to say about that. That's how we'd go about this. Phil, I think one of the largest hurdles to overcome is really reaching decision makers and helping them understand the technology and the needs with it, and recognizing that existing hydrography, the way it exists now, that doesn't line up, doesn't match with what's on imagery, that is a real problem and is causing problems in the eyes of the citizen. And we need to make everyone aware of that.
Thank you, guys. I am going to grab the chat back because I want to get everybody out of here by grab the chat back, grab the screen share back. If I can, again, where are my
I believe I
tools?
stopped. I think I stopped sharing. So
I'm sure you did. I just can't find my tools as usual. All right. And hit the share button. All right, just want to touch base with you all. We will not have a forum next month. Holiday season, it just didn't make a lot of sense. January 18th, our monthly forum will be our quarterly interest group. As you all well know, we do the forum the third Wednesday of the month at this time. So put a placeholder in there. And we'll have our interest group meeting in January, then get back to forum topics again in February. With that, I would very much like to thank our speakers today. As always, lots of information, and just learning from one another's work is so helpful. And I hope everybody stays in communication, and we'll talk to you in January. So thank you all very much.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks,
Thanks, guys.
thanks, Minnesota.
Thanks, Minnesota.
Yeah.